My daughter told me to stop pretending I mattered. Right there in the middle of a crowded restaurant, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. She didn't yell or scream. No, she just said it plainly, cold, sharp, and final. Stop pretending you matter. The words echoed in my head long after the moment passed, like some awful refrain I couldn't silence. I thought that was the end of it, but it was. The CEO sitting next to her, a man I had never met before that day, surprised me in a way I never expected. He disagreed. More than that, he looked right at me and said something that made me question everything I thought about myself, about my worth, about my place in this world. I'm glad you're here because if you've ever felt invisible, dismissed, like your whole life was just a footnote in someone else's story, then this is a story you need to hear. What happened that day wasn't just some random encounter, it was a turning point. A moment when everything I thought was true was shattered and something new, something real began to grow. It all started on an ordinary afternoon, nothing in the air to hint at the storm ahead. I was meeting my daughter for lunch at a small bistro downtown, a quiet place she picked out saying she wanted to talk. I didn't expect what came next. I thought we were just going to catch up, maybe talk about school or the future, but she had something else on her mind. She looked at me with eyes I barely recognized. Not the little girl who used to run to me for comfort, but someone older, harder, like a stranger wearing her face. She said something I never imagined hearing from her, something that felt like a verdict. Stop pretending you matter. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, stunned, watching her as she stared back, waiting for an answer I didn't have. I wanted to scream, to beg her to understand, but all I could do was sit in silence. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to vanish into the cracks of the floor beneath me, because what did I matter, really? A failed dreamer stuck in a dead-end job, a man who'd lost his way somewhere between the past and the future, invisible to the people who mattered most. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just pretending. But then, just as I was spiraling into that dark place, the CEO at the table next to us leaned over. I hadn't even noticed him before. He was impeccably dressed, the kind of man who commands a room without saying a word, tall, confident, a presence that demanded attention. He looked at me with something that didn't look like pity or judgment. It was the complete opposite. He said, "You do matter more than you think." The words felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm I thought I couldn't cross. I wanted to believe him, but how? After everything, after my daughter's words, after the years I'd spent feeling invisible. That moment, his voice cutting through the unbearable silence, changed everything. I want to take you back there. Not just to the restaurant, but to the years before, to the life I'd been living, the choices I'd made, the mistakes I'd carried around like weights on my shoulders. Because this isn't just a story about a hurtful sentence or a stranger's kindness. It's about how a single moment can crack open the darkness and let the light in. I'm going to tell you everything, the raw, unfiltered truth about how I got to that table, how I lost myself, and how maybe, just maybe, I found a way back. But first, you need to understand what it felt like to be me when those words landed. To feel like you're invisible in the eyes of the one person whose opinion means the most. I was sitting there, watching my daughter, feeling like a ghost in her life. Every word she said was like another nail in the coffin of my self-worth. Stop pretending you matter. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a verdict on my entire existence. All those years of trying, failing, hoping, I was just playing a part in a story that no one cared about. And the worst part, I believed it. I believed I was a background character in my own life, a man who showed up but never really existed. But then the CEO's voice broke through that dark bubble. He didn't know me. He hadn't lived my failures or carried my pain, yet he saw something I couldn't see in myself. You do matter. Two simple words, but said with such conviction that I felt something inside me stir. Hope maybe, or the faintest spark of something like belief. It was enough to make me sit up a little straighter, to look him in the eye and realize I wasn't as invisible as I'd thought. That's when I knew I had a choice. I could keep fading away or I could start fighting back. But how do you fight when your own daughter has told you to stop pretending you matter? When your own blood has turned on you in the most brutal way imaginable? That's the question that haunted me as I sat there, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background, the faces around me blurring into shadows. I was trapped between two worlds, the one I'd known for years, filled with disappointment and silence, and a new one opening up right before me, strange and uncertain, but full of possibility. I didn't know it then, but that lunch was going to change everything. Because the CEO, who I later learned was one of the most influential people in our city, didn't just speak words. He challenged me. He saw something worth fighting for when I was ready to give up. And that unexpected moment of kindness became the seed of a journey I never expected to take. I want to tell you how I got from that broken place to the other side, how I found strength I didn't think I had, and how slowly I started to believe in myself again. But first, you need to understand just how deep the hurt went that day and why her words cut so sharp. It wasn't just the sentence itself, it was the weight behind it. The years of silence, the unspoken disappointments, the moments when I was there but not really there. When I was supposed to be a father, a man, someone who mattered, and I thought I was invisible to her, and maybe I was. But then that stranger's voice made me question everything. Maybe I wasn't invisible at all. Maybe I mattered. That's where this story begins, not with pain or regret, but with a single moment of unexpected grace. And it's a moment I want you to hold on to, because sometimes when the people we love the most push us away, it takes a stranger's words to remind us who we really are. But that stranger's voice was just the beginning. What happened next, how I faced my daughter after those words, how I started to rebuild what I thought was lost forever, that's the rest of the story. And I promise you it's not what you think. Because sometimes the people who tell us we don't matter are the ones who need to hear the truth the most. Stay with me. Before everything shattered, before the words that twisted my insides, life felt steady, almost predictable. Our house was small but warm, the kind of place where the walls seemed to hold a gentle kind of comfort. It wasn't perfect, not by any means. There were cracks in the plaster and the paint on the front door peeled in places, but it was home. The kitchen was the heart of the house, with a worn wooden table that had been there longer than I had, scarred by years of spilled coffee, scratched by hurried meals, and stained with the marks of hurried breakfasts when we were always running late. It was where I found a strange sort of peace, the quiet hum of the morning routine wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. Mornings were slow and soft. I'd wake before everyone else, the faint light filtering through thin curtains, the world outside still holding its breath before the day began. The smell of brewing coffee would fill the kitchen as I prepared breakfast, the clink of spoons against mugs mingling with the distant sound of the news on the radio. I liked these moments alone, the calm before the noise of the day. Soon enough, the house would stir, feet padding down the hallway, the rustle of sheets being pulled back, the low murmur of early conversations about school, work, or endless to-do lists. It was all ordinary, but ordinary felt safe. My daughter was the center of this routine, not just because she lived here, but because everything revolved around her in those early years. I watched her grow from a curious toddler into a thoughtful, sharp teenager. Even now, before the lunch that broke everything, she was the same girl who would come into the kitchen, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep but ready to start the day. She had this quiet confidence about her, small but fierce. I remember the way she'd lean against the doorframe, half smiling, waiting for me to finish making her breakfast. Our conversations were simple, sometimes playful, mostly practical. We talked about school projects, her friends, the latest show she'd binge-watched. I'd ask about her dreams, careful not to push too hard, because even then I was aware of the growing distance between us, subtle but real. I wanted to be there, really there, but sometimes it felt like we were always just a few words apart from drifting further. Still, those mornings, sitting across from each other with plates of toast and scrambled eggs, I felt like maybe for a little while things were okay, that maybe I still mattered in her world. On weekends, we had a rhythm of our own. Lazy breakfasts stretched into afternoons filled with errands or quiet walks through the neighborhood park. I'd watch her from a distance, her laughter ringing out as she chased after the dogs or kicked a soccer ball. There were moments when she'd catch my eye and give a small nod or share a quick smile, and I'd hold onto those fragments like treasures. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep me going. I told myself the distance was just a phase, that she was growing into her own person, that we'd find our way back. Our relationship was layered, built on years of shared memories and quiet understanding. There were times when I sensed her frustration, little sighs when I asked too many questions, or the way she'd sometimes retreat into silence after a disagreement. But I also saw her kindness in the small notes she'd leave me on the fridge, the careful way she'd place my coffee cup just so on the table, the moments she'd pause to ask if I was okay. Those gestures were subtle, but they were there. I clung to those things when the days felt heavy. At work, I kept busy with routine tasks, the steady rhythm of my job offering a kind of refuge. I wasn't anyone important in the office hierarchy, just another face in the background, but I took pride in the little things: organizing files, helping colleagues when I could, showing up on time every day. It was a stable place, predictable and safe, much like home. I'd tell myself that this was enough, that stability meant something, even if it didn't always make me feel visible. The weekends and evenings were mine to recharge, to try and be the father I wanted to be. Inside, though, there was a quiet hunger, a restless ache I rarely voiced. I wanted more than just existence, I wanted connection. I wanted my daughter to see me not as a shadow or a background figure, but as someone who mattered. There were nights when I'd lie awake, replaying conversations or missed opportunities, wondering where I had gone wrong. I told myself these were just fears, nothing more than the normal worries of a parent trying to hold onto a fading bond. But sometimes, when the house was still and dark, the silence felt heavier, and I questioned if I was fooling myself. There was a certain rhythm to our lives that I used to find comforting, the ebb and flow of daily routines. The way the familiar made the uncertainty of the world outside seem less daunting. I noticed the small things, like how my daughter's favorite mug was always in the same spot on the counter, or how she'd line up her shoes neatly by the door. These habits, these routines, were silent markers of a life that felt controlled, manageable. They were reminders that despite everything, we were still here, still trying. Looking back, I can see the tiny fractures beneath that calm surface, small cracks that I chose not to acknowledge. There were moments when I caught her looking away just a little too quickly when I asked about her day. Times when she'd answer with a clipped "fine" or "nothing" that felt like a closed door. I noticed the way her phone seemed more important than the conversations we tried to have, the way she sometimes seemed distracted even when she was sitting right beside me. But I told myself it was just teenage moodiness, that she needed space, that I should wait patiently. One afternoon before everything changed, we were sitting together in the living room. She was scrolling through her phone and I was reading the newspaper, the muffled sound of a show playing softly in the background. For a moment, I reached out to touch her arm lightly, a small, tentative gesture. She looked up, met my eyes briefly, but then looked away, her fingers tapping nervously on the screen. I smiled, trying to bridge the gap, but she didn't respond the way I hoped. Instead, there was a flicker of something else, something guarded, distant. That was the first time I noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet barrier that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no shouting or tears, just a fleeting look, a hesitation in her eyes. I told myself it was nothing, that tomorrow would be better, that these things happened. But even then, a small knot of unease settled in my chest. Something was changing between us, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. At home, the evenings were often quiet. We'd eat dinner together most nights, the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of the TV filling the gaps between us. I'd ask about her day, listen to her half-hearted responses, and watch her retreat into her own world. I tried to be patient, to be present, but sometimes it felt like I was holding on to a ghost. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unmet expectations. I wanted to reach her, but I didn't know how. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me out of the corner of her eye, a look that was hard to read. Was it curiosity, resentment, indifference? I never knew. That uncertainty gnawed at me, leaving me second-guessing everything I said or did. I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid to upset the fragile balance we had left. At night, after she'd gone to her room, I'd sit alone in the living room, the quiet pressing in, and wonder where the warmth had gone. Despite everything, there were moments of tenderness, brief flashes of the daughter I knew and loved. She'd sometimes leave little notes on my pillow or send a quick text with a heart emoji. Those gestures were lifelines, reminders that maybe beneath the distance there was still a connection waiting to be repaired. I held on to those moments tightly, using them to fuel my hope for better days, but even in those small acts of kindness, there was an undercurrent of something unresolved. I noticed how she'd sometimes avoid eye contact when I tried to talk about feelings or the past. How she'd change the subject quickly when I mentioned family or future plans. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a quiet retreat that I couldn't quite bridge. I told myself I'd keep trying, that one day she'd let me in again. I remember one particular evening sitting together on the couch while a storm raged outside. The rain tapped steadily against the window, creating a rhythm that matched the steady beat of my thoughts. She was curled up beside me, a blanket pulled up to her chin, and for a moment the world outside felt far away. I reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, and she didn't pull back. It was a small victory, a fleeting moment of closeness that I cherished. But even then, I sensed a hesitation beneath her calm. It felt like we were on the edge of something fragile and uncertain. I wanted to believe we were just fine, that these moments were proof of our bond's strength. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered otherwise. There was distance growing between us, a space filled with things left unsaid, feelings bottled up and hidden away. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that time would heal what was starting to break. Looking back now, I realized that this fragile calm was just the surface. The small cracks, the half-truths, the guarded looks, they were all warning signs of the storm that was coming. Even in those peaceful moments, a sense of unease lingered, like a shadow just beyond the light. I didn't understand it then, but now I see that the quiet before the storm was anything but safe. That day, as we sat together in the late afternoon sun, I caught her glancing at me with a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. A fleeting hesitation, a subtle pull away. She offered a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I felt a small, almost imperceptible distance settle between us, like a crack in glass that I feared might shatter at any moment, and somewhere deep inside I knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. I remember the moment it all began to shift, though at the time I barely noticed. It was one of those mornings that started like any other, quiet routine, a fragile sort of peace hanging in the air between us. My daughter had just finished breakfast, her movements precise, almost mechanical, and as she gathered her things to leave for school, she looked at me with a sharpness I hadn't seen before. I thought it was just a passing glance, but it stayed with me. She said something that felt like a punch to the gut, though it was quiet and almost casual. "Stop pretending you matter." Her voice was steady, almost bored, like she was stating a fact rather than aiming to hurt me. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my face neutral. I didn't know if I should be angry, confused, or sad. Mostly, I just felt disoriented. After that, I watched her leave, the front door clicking shut behind her, and I was left alone with a sudden, cold doubt nestled deep inside me. Was she right? Had I been pretending all this time that I mattered to her, that I mattered at all? I forced myself to breathe slowly. There had to be more to this than just those harsh words. She wouldn't say something like that without a reason. That day I went to work carrying a new kind of weight with me. It wasn't heavy exactly, but it settled in my chest, a quiet pressure that wouldn't let up. I kept replaying her words, trying to find a context, a reason, anything to hold on to. And then it happened at the office in a meeting with a client when I was least prepared for it. The CEO sitting next to me, a man I'd met a handful of times before, caught the look on my face. I wasn't sure if it was empathy or something else, but he leaned closer and said quietly, "You matter more than you think." It felt strange, almost intrusive, to hear those words from him, someone outside my personal life, but that small moment of kindness unsettled me further. It was as if he saw something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. The seed of doubt had already been planted by my daughter, and now this stranger was watering it with a strange kind of reassurance. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just a polite gesture, or was there a deeper understanding behind those words? As the meeting went on, I found myself distracted, my mind wandering back to my daughter's sharp gaze, to the quiet fracture forming between us. I wanted to reach out to ask her what was really going on, but I was also afraid of the answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her bit by bit. That evening at home, the air felt different. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the silence between us stretching longer than usual. I tried to start a conversation to bridge the gap, but she gave me short answers, her eyes focused on her phone. I caught a glimpse of a message on the screen before she quickly hid it away. It wasn't anything explicit, just a few words, but it was enough to make me wonder if there was someone else, someone she trusted more than me. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a friend from school or a group chat that had nothing to do with me, but the unease lingered. As I realized I was no longer part of her world in the way I used to be. She was growing up, pulling away, and I was standing still, desperate to hold on. The next day I tried to be present, more engaged, asking her about her day, about school, about her friends. She answered politely but without enthusiasm, like a stranger responding out of obligation. At one point I caught her glancing toward the door as if waiting for someone. It was probably nothing, but it felt like another door closing on me. At work, the CEO's words echoed in my mind again. "You matter more than you think." I realized I had been going through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that my relationship with my daughter was unbreakable. Maybe I had been fooling myself. I thought about calling her, sending a message, trying to break the silence that was growing between us. But I hesitated. I didn't want to push too hard and risk making things worse. So I waited, watching, listening, trying to read the subtle signs she was giving me. Over the next few days, those signs grew more apparent. She started spending more time in her room, closing the door behind her. Her laughter, once a comforting sound in the house, became rare and distant. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window, lost in thought, as if she was somewhere far away, unreachable. I found myself standing outside her room more often than I cared to admit, wanting to knock, to ask if she was okay. But every time I stopped myself. I told myself she needed space, that she was figuring things out on her own. But deep down I was afraid that space was turning into a wall. One afternoon I came home early, hoping to catch a moment with her. Instead, I found her in the living room, sitting with the CEO from work. It wasn't the encounter itself that unsettled me, it was the way they interacted. The CEO was calm, confident, and seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. She looked up at him with a softness I hadn't seen in weeks. I cleared my throat and they both turned toward me. The CEO smiled politely and my daughter said, "Dad, this is Mr. Harris from work. He's been helping me with a project." The words were casual, but something about their ease together felt like a breach in the distance between us. I nodded, trying not to show the swirl of emotions inside me. I wanted to ask more to understand what kind of connection they had, but I didn't know how without sounding jealous or suspicious. Instead, I excused myself, feeling like an outsider in my own life. That night I lay awake, turning over every detail, every glance, every word exchanged in that room. I wasn't paranoid, I knew something was changing. The question was whether I could do anything to stop it or if I was already too late. The next morning my daughter was quieter than usual, her words clipped and guarded. She avoided my eyes and moved around the house like a shadow. I noticed her phone buzz several times, but she silenced it quickly. I wondered if I should ask about the messages, about the people she was talking to, but I held back. I didn't want to push her further away. Instead, I focused on small gestures, making her favorite breakfast, leaving notes on the fridge, trying to create moments where she might feel safe to open up. But each gesture felt like it bounced off an invisible barrier. I was reaching for something just out of my grasp. One evening, as I was clearing the table, I overheard her talking on the phone in her room. I didn't mean to listen, but her words stopped me cold. She was talking about me not kindly, not with the respect I hoped for, but with a kind of frustration and bitterness I hadn't expected. She said, "He acts like he matters, but he doesn't really." The words echoed the ones she'd said to me weeks before. I swallowed hard and walked away, not ready to confront her yet, but the doubt in my mind deepened. Was this really how she saw me? Had I become invisible, irrelevant in her life? I wanted to believe there was more beneath the surface, something she couldn't express, but the cracks were widening. Days turned into a pattern of uneasy silences and stolen glances. I found myself watching her from a distance, trying to piece together who she was becoming and where I fit in that picture. The CEO's presence lingered like a shadow too, a reminder that the world outside was shifting as much as the one inside my home. One afternoon, I stumbled across a message on her laptop while she was out, a brief conversation with the CEO. The tone was friendly, supportive, almost like a lifeline. They talked about goals, about plans, about things she hadn't shared with me. For a moment, I felt a surge of something I couldn't name, jealousy, maybe, or fear. I closed the laptop quickly, guilt washing over me. She deserved privacy, but I couldn't ignore the growing gap between us. This wasn't just a phase, it was a quiet unraveling of everything I thought we had. That night I sat alone in the dark, replaying the last few weeks in my mind. The harsh words, the silences, the hidden conversations. I wanted to believe that I still mattered to her, that our bond was unbreakable. But the truth was harder to face. I was watching the person I loved most slip away, and I wasn't sure I had the power to hold on. The next morning, I decided to try one last time. I waited until she was home from school and sat down with her in the kitchen, trying to find the right words. I told her I wanted to understand, that I wanted to be there for her. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought we might break through the wall. But then she said it again, softly this time, almost like a warning. "You're pretending, Dad, pretending you matter." The words hit harder than before, but this time there was a flicker of something else, pain maybe, or fear. I reached out my hand, but she pulled away. I realized then that this was just the beginning. The fracture was real and the space between us was growing. I didn't know how much longer I could pretend either. And then, in that quiet, heavy moment, the CEO's words came back to me. "You matter more than you think." I wanted to believe him, I needed to believe him, but I wasn't sure if it was meant for me or just a kindness from a stranger. I sat back, feeling the weight of everything gathered around me, the doubt, the distance, the fragile hope. I didn't know what would come next, only that nothing would ever be quite the same again. I couldn't sleep that night. The words my daughter had thrown at me echoed relentlessly inside my head. "Stop pretending you matter." Those words weren't just cruel, they were a gut punch to the core of who I thought I was as a father. I kept replaying every interaction, every look, every silence between us, searching for a clue, some evidence to either prove or disprove what she said. Was she right? Was I really just pretending to matter to her? Or was there something darker beneath the surface that I hadn't seen? The next day, I found myself digging through old messages on my phone, texts, emails, anything that might show the state of our relationship over time. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. There were countless unanswered messages from me, texts I'd sent hoping for a response. Days, sometimes weeks, would pass with no reply. Then when she did answer, it was always curt, distant, almost like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging me at all. It was the silence in between that screamed the loudest. I remember one text I found from months ago. I had asked how school was going, and the reply was just fine. No follow-up, no question back, nothing. I felt a sharp sting. Was this the real her? Or was this the version she presented when she wanted to shut me out? I realized the gap hadn't just appeared overnight. It had been widening for a long time, and somehow I had been blind to the signs. I'd spent so much time hoping, pretending things were okay, that I never really saw the distance growing. I kept scrolling and then stopped on a message she sent to a friend that I accidentally saw because she'd left her phone unlocked near me once. It wasn't meant for me, but the words cut deeper than anything she'd ever said to my face. I don't want to deal with him anymore. It's like he doesn't even try to understand me. I don't know why I looked, but once I did, I couldn't stop. It was like opening a door to a room I wasn't supposed to enter, and everything inside was broken. That message confirmed a truth I was afraid to admit. She felt like I wasn't trying. I wasn't just failing her, I was failing myself as a father. All those nights I stayed up thinking about how to fix things, all the moments I thought I was reaching out, she felt nothing but frustration and exhaustion. The betrayal wasn't from her, it was my own inability to be the father she needed. I sat down hard on the edge of my bed, my hands trembling. I couldn't breathe right. This wasn't just a relationship on the rocks, it was a collapse. The foundation I thought we'd built had crumbled beneath us, and I was left to pick up the pieces alone. I thought about the CEO from work, the one who had stepped in when I was at my lowest. The man who, without knowing the details, had seen the pain in my eyes and told me I mattered, that I was more than the sum of my failures. His words echoed in my mind, but now they seemed distant, almost unreal. How could he believe in me when my own daughter didn't? Was it just kindness, or had he seen something I had missed? I decided I needed to confront this head-on. I needed proof, not just the painful evidence that I was failing, but something that would confirm if I still mattered to her, if there was any hope left. I went back through everything: photos, school reports, notes from teachers, her social media posts, anything that might hint at how she truly felt about me. But all I found was a cold emptiness, like she was deliberately erasing me from her life. The final piece of evidence came when I found a message thread between her and a classmate, talking about their families. She mentioned me briefly, but only to say how little I was involved. "He's always around, but it's like he's not really here," she wrote. That line slammed into me like a freight train. I was physically present, but emotionally absent. That was the truth I had to face. I couldn't stop questioning myself. Was I really pretending to matter, or was I just invisible to her? The lines blurred until I couldn't tell the difference. I felt like I was spiraling, losing my grip on reality. Every smile she gave me felt forced, every word hollow. Was she just being polite, or did she genuinely feel that I was a stranger in her life? My mind raced back to the moments I thought we were connecting, the dinner conversations, the movie nights, the birthday celebrations. Were those just facades? Performances I put on to convince myself I was still important to her. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that she had been shutting me out piece by piece, day by day, and I had been willingly blind to it. The weight of that realization crushed me. I felt like I'd been living a lie, playing a role that was no longer mine. The betrayal wasn't hers, it was mine. I had failed to see the truth she was trying to show me. How could I have missed the pain in her eyes, the hesitation in her voice? I was supposed to be her safe place, not a stranger she tolerated. I remember sitting on the floor of my empty living room, the silence around me so loud it was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like the air itself was a trap. The tears came without warning, hot and relentless. For the first time, I truly understood what it meant to feel completely alone in the world. I thought about calling the CEO back, needing someone to hold on to, someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. But even then, I hesitated. How could I talk about this failure? How could I explain that the person I loved most had told me I didn't matter? Would he understand, or would he see me as weak, as broken? The silence crept in again, filling every corner of my mind, pushing out hope, leaving only doubt. I started questioning everything: my worth, my purpose, my ability to love and be loved. If my own daughter thought I was pretending, then who was I really, and did I even deserve to matter? Days passed in a blur. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped answering calls. I couldn't face the world, couldn't face her. Every attempt to reach out had been met with distance, and that rejection cut deeper than any words could. I was drowning in a sea of my own failures, grasping for something solid to hold on to, but there was nothing. Memories of better times haunted me. The way she used to run to me with open arms, the nights she'd curl up beside me telling me about her dreams. Now those memories were like shards of glass piercing through the fabric of my broken heart, reminding me of what I'd lost. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some clarity, some way to rebuild from the wreckage, but even in those sessions, the truth was relentless. The therapist asked me to explore my own role in this fracture, forcing me to confront uncomfortable realities. I wasn't blameless. My absence, both physical and emotional, had left scars. I was part of the reason for the distance. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also the beginning of something. If I wanted to heal, I had to accept the pain fully, let it break me down to build something new. But even with that realization, the loneliness was overwhelming. The hole in my chest where my daughter's love used to be felt like a void I might never fill. Then came the day I found the letter. It wasn't addressed to me, at least not directly. It was a note she'd written but never sent, tucked away in the pages of a book she'd left behind. I found it by accident, and my hands trembled as I read her words. She wrote about feeling invisible, about the weight of expectations she couldn't meet. She wrote about anger, frustration, and the pain of feeling like she had to protect herself from me because I was too broken to protect her. But beneath the anger, there was something else: hope. A faint thread of hope that maybe someday we could find our way back. Reading that note shattered me and held a fragile thread of hope at the same time. She was hurting in ways I hadn't imagined, and so was I. We were both trapped in a cycle of pain and misunderstanding, each pushing the other further away. That letter was the final piece of evidence I needed. It confirmed the truth I dreaded: we were torn apart, but not beyond repair. There was a chasm between us, wide and deep, but it wasn't an abyss. If I wanted to matter to her again, I had to cross that chasm, no matter how impossible it seemed. But that night, as I sat alone with her words in my hands, the weight of it all pressed down harder than ever. I felt utterly broken, a man stripped of hope, drowning in regret. The betrayal wasn't just hers or mine, it was the betrayal of a future we'd never have unless we found a way back. And I didn't know if I had the strength left to try. The silence in the house was deafening, and in that silence I realized I was more alone than I had ever been. The moment the letter sat unread on my desk, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. That quiet, cold clarity, the kind that comes when pain no longer blinds you but sharpens your vision, began to take root. I had been drowning in guilt, in regret, in the endless loop of what I should have done, what I failed to do. But all of that was a tide pulling me under. Now, for the first time, I realized I needed to stop flailing and start steering. Not for forgiveness, not yet, but for control. I wasn't just going to be the broken father anymore. Maybe I never was, at least not fully. Instead, I was something else, something colder, something focused. My daughter told me to stop pretending I mattered. The CEO next to her, an outsider with no reason to care about our fractured family, disagreed. That disagreement was a door, an unexpected alliance in the midst of my unraveling. I wasn't sure how or why, but it was the crack of light I needed. I began by sitting down with the stark reality of what I had. I had no easy way back into her life, no heartfelt apologies, no promises to fix everything. Those were empty, and she knew it. What I had instead was time and a plan to use it carefully. I wrote lists detailed and deliberate, not of grand gestures or desperate pleas, but of small, incremental steps that could peel back years of resentment. Each item on my list was a calculated move, a piece of leverage in the quiet war I intended to fight, not against my daughter, but against the distance between us. I started with the simplest, learning what mattered to her now. The books she read, the music that played through her headphones, the topics she was passionate about. I subscribed to newsletters she followed, saved articles linked to topics she liked, and made a habit of quietly observing from a distance. No intrusions, no demands, just presence in the shadows. At first, it felt unnatural, as if I were a ghost haunting my own daughter's life, trying to learn her language and customs after years of absence. But that cold distance gave me something else, perspective. I saw patterns where once there was only chaos. I understood more clearly than I ever had how much she had built her defenses, how she'd armored herself against disappointment. That armor wasn't just about me, it was a shield forged from a lifetime of feeling unseen and unheard. There was a grim satisfaction in recognizing that. It meant she was vulnerable, even if she didn't realize it. And I was going to find the cracks in that armor. Slowly, methodically, I began drafting messages, carefully crafted sentences that didn't beg or plead but simply offered. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't even promise to be perfect. I just made small acknowledgments. I'm here, I'm listening, I want to understand. I sent the first message with trembling fingers and a cold resolve. No immediate response came. That was expected, and I wasn't going to let silence break me. Instead, I planned my next moves like a strategist plotting a campaign. I would keep reaching out, but not too much. I would respect her boundaries, but subtly push at them. The idea of control was new to me in this context. For so long, I had assumed love alone would be enough to bridge the gap, that heartfelt apologies could rewrite the past. But love without control had left me powerless. Now I realized control was not about dominance or coercion. It was about steering the narrative, about choosing how to respond rather than react. In the quiet nights when the house was empty and my thoughts loud, I found myself wrestling with darker feelings. Betrayal, bitterness, a simmering anger that I had kept buried. These emotions were dangerous fuel, but also necessary fire. They sharpened my focus and gave me energy to push forward. I was no longer just a broken man begging for scraps of connection. I was a man determined to reclaim his place, whatever it took. I began imagining the conversations that might come, the defenses she would raise, the walls she would put between us. But I was ready. I wouldn't fall into the trap of pleading or apologizing again. Instead, I would be deliberate, measured. If she said I didn't matter, I'd show her that I did, through actions, through persistence, through a presence she couldn't ignore. This was not about manipulation or revenge, at least not in the obvious sense. It was a cold recalibration of power. I realized that by reclaiming control over my own emotions and actions, I could shift the balance. And quietly, I let myself entertain a thought I had pushed away for too long. Maybe part of this was about making those who dismissed me, like the ones who never took me seriously, feel the weight of my resolve. There was a subtle thrill in that. It wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about proving to myself and to the world that I was not invisible, that my absence had consequences. The CEO's unexpected support had emboldened me. If someone so detached from my personal pain believed I mattered, maybe I was right to feel this fire. I started keeping track of small victories, the times she glanced my way without turning away, the rare moments when she didn't immediately close off. They were like tiny cracks in a wall, but enough to give me hope. With each passing day, my cold resolve hardened. I stopped asking for permission to exist in her world. Instead, I carved out a space and waited for her to notice. Emotionally, the process was draining, but also strangely clarifying. I felt the old ache of loneliness, but it was tempered now by a sense of purpose. I was no longer drowning in self-pity. I was navigating the storm with quiet intent. I knew this path wouldn't be easy, and I was prepared for setbacks. But I also knew I had something I didn't have before: control over my own narrative. I reflected on how easy it had been to let despair consume me before, how passively I had accepted my role as the failed father. That identity had been handed to me like a sentence, but now I was rewriting it, not with forgiveness or sentimentality, but with cold, deliberate action. I realized revenge wasn't about hurting her or anyone else. It was about reclaiming myself from the wreckage of broken relationships. It was about standing up to the ghost of the man I had been so that the man I wanted to be could take his place. For the first time, I stopped waiting for her to reach out. I stopped hoping she would soften on her own. Instead, I took the reins. I would build a new relationship on my terms, not the naive, hopeful terms of before, but the hard-earned terms of someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to fight. And yet, even as I embraced this control, I felt a cold loneliness settle deeper. It was a loneliness born not of absence, but of choice, because I knew some bridges might never be rebuilt, some wounds might never fully heal, but I was done being a passive victim of those losses. I was ready to be the architect of whatever future remained. I thought back to the CEO's words, the quiet conviction in his disagreement with my daughter. That man didn't know me, and yet he had seen something worth defending. Maybe it was my stubbornness. Maybe it was the faint flicker of a man who refused to be erased. That flicker was now a flame, subtle but steady. I didn't rush, I didn't shout or beg, I planned, I acted, and I waited. I watched how the smallest gestures rippled outward, how a single message could shift the atmosphere in a room. Every step was a calculation, every silence a battlefield. Occasionally, my thoughts darkened toward what might happen if she never came around. The idea of cold revenge whispered to me not in loud declarations, but in the quiet satisfaction of proving my worth despite her rejection. Not hurting her, but protecting myself from the pain of being dismissed. That thin line between love and resentment was blurring, but I welcomed the ambiguity. It gave me strength. I was no longer naive about what it would take. I understood that to matter, I might have to be unrecognizable to the man I once was. In those moments of reflection, I allowed myself a flicker of something dangerous, hope wrapped in steel, a promise whispered in the dark. This was my choice. This was my fight. And if she told me I didn't matter, I would show her that I mattered enough to refuse to disappear quietly. The quiet before the storm was upon me now. I was calm, deliberate, cold in my resolve. The pieces were falling into place, and I was ready to move when the time came, because I knew this wasn't just about mending a broken relationship. It was about reclaiming a life that had been written off too soon, and the next move was mine to make. I stood there, the words still sharp in the air. Stop pretending you mattered. My daughter's voice had broken something inside me before, but now in this room crowded with strangers, it was about to explode. She didn't see it, but the man next to her did. The CEO, the unexpected ally who, until a moment ago, had been just a face in the crowd. He shifted forward, his eyes locking on mine like a challenge thrown down. I felt the weight of the room shift. The silence stretched just long enough for disbelief to settle in. Then that man, steady, authoritative, cut through it all. No, he said, calm, firm, you do matter. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was an exposure, a weapon wielded in my favor. I caught my breath. My daughter's stare flickered, surprised, maybe even a little unsettled. I could see the edge of confusion in her eyes, the sudden crack in her armor of certainty. The CEO didn't wait. He looked at her, then back at me. Sometimes the people who matter most are the ones who don't shout the loudest. They show up, they stay even when it's hard. His words dropped like stones in a still pond. Ripples raced across my mind. The audience was frozen, caught between shock and curiosity. I swallowed the lump in my throat. For years, I'd been a ghost in my daughter's life, invisible, irrelevant. Today, I was not invisible anymore. The CEO's stance slammed into the room like a verdict. He wasn't just defending me. He was exposing the truth my daughter had tried to bury under anger and silence. I wasn't just someone who'd failed her. I was someone who still fought for a chance to matter. And now the fight wasn't just mine. Her eyes flashed with something I hadn't seen in a long time, doubt. She opened her mouth, ready to push back, but the CEO held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Listen, he said, voice low, I don't know your story. But I know this, people don't always get to choose when they start mattering. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's painful, but it's real and it deserves respect. His words hit like a punch. The room shifted. I saw heads nodding subtly. The tide was turning, my daughter's jaw tight. She looked away, blinking rapidly as if trying to hide the crack in her armor. That moment felt like a victory, not because she gave in, but because the truth was out there now, unmistakable and undeniable. I felt a surge build inside me, cold, sharp. The kind of clarity that only comes when you're pushed to the edge. I grabbed that moment. Yeah, I said, voice low but steady. I pretended for a long time, pretended like my mistakes didn't leave scars. Pretended like I didn't see the distance growing between us. But I've stopped pretending. I'm here, I matter, and I'm not going away. The CEO nodded. That's right. The room was electric now, not with excitement, not with anger, but with raw truth laid bare. My daughter's gaze met mine again. This time it wasn't just fire, it was pain, confusion, a storm brewing behind her eyes. She turned sharply and walked out. The door slammed behind her. Silence filled the space she left behind. I stood there, chest tight, heart pounding. The CEO's eyes met mine, no words, just understanding. The moment felt like a climax, yes, but it wasn't an ending, it was a turning point. A fracture exposed, bleeding truth into the light. I realized then it wasn't about winning an argument or forcing forgiveness. It was about breaking through the walls we'd both built, about peeling back the layers of hurt and pride and fear, and that was messy, it was slow, it was terrifying, but it was real. The CEO stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You did good, you're not invisible anymore. I nodded, swallowing the lump again. The road ahead was still uncertain. My daughter's rejection still stung like a fresh wound. But this time I felt something different, something stronger. I mattered. At least I was no longer pretending, and that was the first step. Then, as the door clicked shut behind her, I caught a glimpse of her just for a second, hesitating in the hallway. Her shoulders trembled. I knew this wasn't far from it, but for the first time in years I had a foothold, and I was ready to climb. The room emptied quickly after that. People offered nods, some whispered words of encouragement. Most left, leaving me and the CEO alone. He smiled, a rare softness breaking through his usual composure. You've got more fight in you than you think. I returned the smile, a flicker of hope sparking in my chest. Thanks, I said, for standing up, for saying what she wouldn't. He shrugged. Sometimes the truth needs a voice, especially when the people closest to us try to silence it. I looked down at my hands. They weren't trembling anymore. The fracture was still there. The distance between me and my daughter hadn't vanished, but the foundation was shifting. And it was only a matter of time before something changed. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face like a wake-up call. I wasn't pretending anymore, I mattered, and I wasn't going to let her or anyone else make me feel invisible again. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. As I walked away, I glanced back once more, hoping to see her standing there, waiting, wondering, maybe even wanting, but the hallway was empty. Still, I held on to the one thing that mattered now. The truth was out, and that truth was mine to own. I was no longer the man who begged for scraps of love. I was the man who claimed it piece by piece, and this time I was ready for whatever came next. Because sometimes the hardest battles don't end with forgiveness. They start with being seen. And today I was finally seen. But more than that, I was standing tall, no longer pretending, no longer invisible, just me, and that was enough for now, and maybe someday soon it would be enough for her too, but until then I would keep fighting. Because if I didn't, who would? The truth had been spoken, the silence shattered, and I was ready to face whatever came next, with or without her, because I mattered, and I was done pretending. And that was the sharp edge I carried with me as I stepped into the uncertain future, one breath at a time, one moment at a time, until the distance between us was no longer a chasm but a bridge, and I held the first plank. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. After the CEO's words hung in the air, a quiet settled over us. The noise, the tension, the stinging accusations, all of it faded like a wave pulling back from the shore. I was left with a stillness that felt both strange and necessary. I remember sitting there, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on me in a way that was almost physical. It wasn't relief or joy, it was something quieter, a tired kind of peace, as if my soul had been stretched and pulled, and now it was finally allowed to rest, even if only for a moment. In the days that followed, the house was different. Not because anyone said anything more, but because the energy between us had shifted. My daughter didn't suddenly start speaking kindly or pretending the past hadn't marred our relationship. No, that distance remained, a chasm I wasn't sure I could cross anytime soon, but somehow I didn't feel invisible anymore. The CEO's intervention, brief as it was, gave me a footing I hadn't had in years. It reminded me that I did matter, even if it was just to that one stranger in that moment, and that mattered enough to start rebuilding from. I didn't pretend after that. I stopped hiding behind silence or retreating when things got hard. I started showing up in small ways, letting myself be seen, even when I was scared of what might come back. I began making coffee in the morning, laying out breakfast with more care, and trying to find points of connection with my daughter, even if they were tiny and fragile. Sometimes she looked at me without the usual hardness, and those moments felt like little victories, though I knew they were just the start of a long road. The loss was still there, heavy and raw. I lost the daughter I wished I had, the one who would tell me she loved me without hesitation. I lost years of closeness that I might never get back, and I lost parts of myself too, my pride, my certainty, my illusions about how things should be. But I found something else in the wreckage. I found a new kind of strength, a quiet resilience that didn't need validation or applause. It was enough to keep going, to keep trying, to hold on to hope even when it felt dim. The CEO's words echoed in my mind often after that day. He said, "You do matter." Simple, straightforward. No fanfare, no hidden meaning, just a truth I had forgotten or maybe never fully believed. It was like a seed planted in dry soil, waiting to grow, waiting for me to nurture it with patience and courage. I began to see that my worth wasn't tied to my daughter's approval or anyone else's. It was something I had to claim for myself day by day. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when I lay awake asking myself if this was all worth it. If the pain of facing rejection was worth the hope of reconciliation. But then I thought of that small truth, that quiet affirmation, and it gave me the strength to face another day, to show up again, imperfect and vulnerable but real. I started writing again, not stories or grand ideas, but honest notes to myself about what I was feeling. Sometimes I wrote letters to my daughter, letters I didn't send but kept safe in a drawer. It was a way to process the storm inside me without the fear of immediate judgment or dismissal. Those letters became a mirror, reflecting my fears and hopes back to me. They helped me see that healing wouldn't be linear. There would be setbacks and misunderstandings, but also moments of grace and connection if I stayed patient. I also reached out to others, old friends, colleagues, even professionals who could help me navigate this new terrain. I learned to lean on support without feeling weak. It was awkward and uncomfortable at first, but slowly I realized that vulnerability could be a bridge, not just a crack in my armor. There were conversations that didn't go well, but some that opened doors I didn't know existed. I found new communities, people who valued me for who I was, not for how well I performed or how close I was to my daughter. The hardest part was accepting that some things might never change, that my daughter might never fully forgive me or see me the way I hoped, but I also understood that my worth wasn't suspended on her acceptance. It existed independently, stubborn and persistent. That realization didn't make the pain disappear, but it softened the sharp edges. It gave me a foundation to stand on even when the ground felt shaky. I became more mindful of what I could control and what I could. I stopped chasing what was out of reach and started focusing on what I could nurture, my own healing, my own kindness, and the small moments of connection that appeared now and then. Sometimes it was a shared meal without argument. Sometimes it was a brief conversation about something ordinary. Sometimes it was just breathing in the same room without feeling like enemies. These small things became victories in their own right. The CEO's unexpected role in all of this stayed with me as a reminder that sometimes strangers see us more clearly than those closest to us. That external validation, while not a substitute for genuine connection, can still offer a lifeline when we're drowning in self-doubt. I never saw him again, but his words were a beacon during the darkest nights, a signal that even when those we love don't affirm us, others might, and that's enough to begin rebuilding a sense of self-worth. I learned to forgive myself too, not for the mistakes or failures, but for the times I gave up on myself before the fight was even over. Forgiveness was slow and uneven, but it was a crucial part of moving forward. I stopped beating myself up for the past and started treating myself with the care I deserved. That shift wasn't about forgetting or excusing what happened, but about choosing to carry my story without shame or self-loathing. In time, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a home, imperfect and bruised but still standing. The silence between my daughter and me became less hostile, and sometimes, just sometimes, it even felt like a space waiting to be filled with something new. I didn't know what that something was yet. Maybe it was forgiveness or understanding or simply acceptance. Whatever it was, I was ready to wait for it, no longer pretending it would come overnight. I also saw changes in myself that surprised me. I became more patient, more open to uncertainty. I learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. I practiced gratitude for the small things, a kind smile, a quiet morning, a moment of stillness. Those moments stitched together a new fabric of life, one woven with fragile hope and cautious determination. The journey ahead was still daunting. I knew there would be days when despair crept back in and old wounds reopened. But I had tasted a peace I hadn't known in years, a peace that came from simply being present with my pain and choosing to keep moving forward even when I felt tired and unsure. I thought about the daughter I longed for, the one who might someday see me differently. I didn't know if that day would come. But for the first time, I believed it was possible, even if it was far away. And I was willing to keep showing up, to keep trying, because giving up would mean erasing a part of myself that was still alive and yearning. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself replaying the confrontation in my head. Her words, harsh and cutting, still stung. But the CEO's voice, the calm, unwavering affirmation, became the anchor. You do matter. I held on to those words like a lifeline, a quiet rebellion against the loneliness and rejection. They reminded me that worth isn't always visible, especially to those we love, but it exists nonetheless. I realized that my story wasn't just about pain and loss. It was also about survival and growth, about finding meaning in the cracks and scars. It was about reclaiming my identity not as someone defined by rejection, but as someone who dared to hope, who dared to heal, who dared to keep loving despite everything. The hardest peace is the one you make with yourself when you know you've been broken but refuse to stay that way. That peace settled into me gradually, like a slow tide washing over dry land, softening the edges and nourishing new life. It didn't erase the past or the hurt, but it made space for something else, something quieter and stronger. I'm still working on that piece, still learning what it means to matter in a world that sometimes forgets you exist. But I'm no longer pretending. I'm no longer shrinking away to avoid pain. I'm here in the mess, in the silence, ready to face whatever comes next with an open heart. Because maybe that's what matters most, not the approval or recognition from others, but the courage to keep standing when you feel unseen. The courage to believe that even in the darkest moments, there's a flicker of light worth holding onto. And so I wait, waiting for the day when the silence between us is no longer a barrier, but a bridge. Waiting for the moment when my daughter's eyes soften, when her voice drops the sharp edge, when she tells me maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday that I do matter to her too. Until then I carry on, tired yes, but peaceful in a way I never was before, knowing that even if the road is long and uncertain, it's still mine to walk. And that in itself is a kind of resolution worth holding on to. But as I sit here feeling the quiet settle around me once again, I can't help but wonder, what if that moment never comes? What if the distance between us remains forever? And in that thought, a new fear stirs, whispering that maybe some wounds aren't meant to heal completely. Maybe some stories don't have neat endings. Maybe the real challenge is learning to live with the unanswered questions, the broken pieces, and the fragile hope all at once. And so the waiting continues unchanged, yet somehow different, because I am no longer the man who pretended he didn't matter. I am the man who knows deep down that he does, even if no one else sees it yet. It's strange how a single moment can shift the weight of a lifetime. After the CEO's words, there was a quietness inside me that didn't feel empty or hollow, but something softer, like a fragile kind of peace slowly settling in. I wasn't suddenly healed or fixed, far from it. But for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to carry the burden of being invisible in my daughter's eyes. I could begin to matter to myself, at least. That night I sat alone in my living room, the house quiet around me. I thought about how she told me to stop pretending I mattered. Those words had cut deep, but the CEO's agreement with her had done something unexpected. It reminded me that sometimes when we feel rejected by those closest to us, the rejection isn't the whole story. There are others who see us, who believe in us, even when we can't yet find that belief within ourselves. I realized then that self-worth isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you claim for yourself, piece by piece, even if the people you love the most can't or won't see it right now. I didn't have to wait for her forgiveness or recognition to begin valuing my own existence. That was a small but powerful shift, one that I'm still learning to live with every day. It's taken time to get here, days filled with doubt, nights heavy with loneliness. But with each passing moment, I've tried to be kinder to myself. I've allowed the vulnerability to surface instead of hiding it away. Vulnerability felt risky, but it was the only way forward. Authenticity, messy and imperfect as it is, became my anchor. There were no grand gestures or sudden breakthroughs with my daughter. The distance between us remained, a quiet ache that never fully goes away. But in the spaces between that ache, I found moments, small, tentative moments, where connection might begin to grow again. A brief message, a shared silence, an unspoken understanding that we're both trying, even if it looks different from the outside. I remember one afternoon when she called me unexpectedly. The conversation was short and awkward, but her voice held a softness that I hadn't heard in a long time. It wasn't a fix-all moment, but it felt like a crack in the wall that separated us. I held on to that call like a lifeline, a reminder that healing is not linear and that hope can come in the smallest packages. I also learned the importance of self-forgiveness. For every mistake, every moment I wish I could take back, I'm learning to say to myself, you did your best with what you had. It's not about excusing the past, but about freeing myself from the burden of shame. That freedom has been a gift I didn't expect to receive. And while I continue to hope for reconciliation, I've come to understand that my worth isn't tied to her acceptance. I am enough even when she can't see it. This doesn't mean I no longer want her love or approval. Those desires remain deep inside me, but I've learned to hold them more gently without letting them define my sense of self. This journey has been about showing up authentically. No more pretending to be someone I'm not to earn affection or approval. No more silencing my own feelings to avoid conflict. I'm learning to be brave in my own skin, to speak my truth, and to allow myself to be seen, even with all the flaws and fears. There's a quiet strength in vulnerability. It doesn't look like the kind of strength we often admire in stories or movies. It's not loud or flashy. It's the courage to face rejection, to endure loneliness, and to keep hoping for connection despite it all. I didn't expect to find that strength in myself, especially not after the words my daughter spoke. But I'm grateful for the CEO's unexpected intervention. It was like a hand reaching out when I thought I was alone in the dark. That hand reminded me that I mattered, not because of what others said, but because I'm human, flawed, struggling, and trying. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. No matter how broken or distant your relationships might feel, your worth is not determined by the acceptance of others. It's found in the quiet moments when you choose to be kind to yourself. It's in the bravery of showing up even when it hurts, and it's in the hope that healing, no matter how slow or complicated, is always possible. I know this won't be the end of my story or my daughter's. We still have walls to tear down and conversations to have. But now I face those challenges with a little more patience, a little more grace, and a lot more hope. Because hope is what keeps us moving forward, even when the path is uncertain. So if you're listening and carrying your own invisible wounds, please know you're not alone. There are people who believe in you even when it feels like the world has turned away. And more importantly, there's a part of you that's worthy of love and healing just as you are. Thank you for walking this part of my journey with me. It means more than I can say. Did you like my story? Please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story of mine travels. Remember, sometimes the hardest person to convince that we matter is ourselves. But once we do, everything begins to change.